Jacob Gershwin was born on September 26, 1898 in the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn. His father Morris was a manager at a women's shoe factory, and both him and his wife Rose were Russian Jewish immigrants originally from St. Petersburg. Jacob, who soon after became known as George, was the second of 4 kids. He had an older brother named Ira, a younger brother named Arthur, and a younger sister named Frances. The Gershwin family moved around a lot as Morris would change jobs frequently. They were also active in the Yiddish theater district, with George occasionally appearing on stage as an extra. George wasn't interested in music until age 10 when he heard his friend's violin recital. His parents bought Ira a piano, but to their surprise and Ira's relief, George ended up using the piano more often. He studied with various piano teachers before being introduced to Charles Hambitzer sometime around 1913. Hambitzer became a musical mentor to George, teaching him piano technique, introducing him to classical music, and encouraged him to attend orchestra concerts. Despite this, Frances was actually the first to make a living from music, but she got married young and devoted herself to being a mother and housewife. Arthur would also become a musician. Gershwin left school at age 15 and worked as a song plugger on Tin Pan Alley, a collection of music publishers in Manhattan's Flower District on West 28th Street. He earned $15 a week for Jerome H. Remick and Company. Gershwin's first published song was When You Want 'Em, You Can't Get 'Em, When You've Got 'Em, You Don't Want 'Em, written in 1916, which earned the composer a total of 50 cents. He also produced piano rolls under pseudonyms and began recording and arranging for Aeolian Company and Standard Music Rolls. Gershwin recorded his own works for Duo Art and Welton Mignon player pianos. He also performed vaudeville works, accompanying Nora Bass and Louise Dresser on piano. Gershwin's first song to appear on Broadway was his Making of a Girl, which he co-composed with Sigmund Rongbird, and lyrics written by Harold Atteridge. It was performed at the Passing Show of 1916 at the Winter Garden Theater. Other works written around this time include Beautiful Bird, O Land of Mine America, which he submitted for a competition by the New York American for a national anthem, and Lullaby for string quartet. Gershwin wrote his first national hit, Swanee, in 1919, with lyrics written by Irving Caesar. Singer Al Jolson heard the song at a party and decided to sing it in one of his shows. Gershwin also met music director William Merrigan Daly in the late 1910s, collaborating with him on the Broadway musicals Piccadilly to Broadway, For Goodness Sake, and Arnell. Gershwin and Daly became lifelong friends, and Daly frequently arranged, orchestrated, and conducted Gershwin's music and gave him musical advice. Gershwin also began working with Buddy DeSilva in the early 1920s. In 1922, Gershwin wrote his experimental one-act jazz opera, Blue Monday. Unfortunately, while all the singing roles were black, the original production was done by white actors in blackface. Although interestingly, it was orchestrated by a black man. The opera was received warmly after its premiere in New Haven, Connecticut, but only lasted one performance on Broadway. A New York World Review called it, quote, the most dismal, stupid, and incredible blackface sketch that has probably ever been perpetuated. In 1923, Canadian-American singer Ava Gautier organized an experimental classical jazz concert. This concert led to bandleader Paul Whiteman to ask Gershwin to write a concerto for a jazz band. This resulted in Gershwin's first major work, Rhapsody in Blue. It was orchestrated by Ferdy Groffet and premiered by Whiteman's band with Gershwin as a soloist. The premiere took place at the Aeolian Hall for the 115th birthday of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. The piece became Gershwin's most popular work and established his style of blending jazz and classical music. He then collaborated with his brother Ira on the musical Lady Be Good, which includes notable standards such as Fascinating Rhythm and Oh Lady Be Good. In 1925, Gershwin was commissioned by conductor Walter Damrosch to write Concerto in F. It premiered at Carnegie Hall and was well received by the public. Critics, however, gave mixed reviews, with Russian composer Sergei Prokofiev calling it, quote, amateurish. It was around this time when Gershwin began a decade-long affair with composer Kay Swift, with whom he talked about music. The two of them never married, even after Swift divorced her husband to continue the affair. According to Swift's granddaughter, Gershwin's mother was apparently unhappy that Swift wasn't Jewish. In any case, Gershwin wrote OK in 1926, which was named after Swift. The musical ran for 256 performances on Broadway, and an additional 213 performances on London's West End. Other works written around this time include Funny Face and Strike Up the Band. Gershwin went to Paris in the mid-1920s and applied to study composition under the renowned pedagogue Nadia Boulanger. However, she and composer Maurice Ravel both turned him down, believing that classical training would ruin Gershwin's style. Ravel would go so far as to say, quote, why be a second-rate Ravel when you're a first-rate Gershwin? The trip to Paris inspired Gershwin to write his tone poem, An American in Paris, in 1928. The premiere at Carnegie Hall was met with mixed reviews, but the piece soon became standard repertoire in Europe and the US. Between 1929 and 1931, George and Ira would collab with 3 new musicals, Showgirl, Girl Crazy, and Of Thee I Sing. The last one became the first musical to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Gershwin then went on vacation to Havana, Cuba in 1932, writing Cuban Overture for orchestra. The piece makes use of Caribbean rhythms and Cuban percussion, including bongos, claves, aguero, and maracas. It was premiered by the New York Philharmonic, conducted by Albert Coates. Gershwin spent the summer of 1934 in Folly Beach, South Carolina, with author DuBose Hayward. The trip inspired the composer to write his opera Porgy and Bess, which Hayward wrote the libretto for. Ira would also write the lyrics to some of the songs, including the most famous one, Summertime. The opera premiered at the Colonial Theater in Boston before its run on Broadway, which ended up being a commercial failure. Critics at the time couldn't decide whether Porgy and Bess was an opera or an ambitious Broadway musical. Theater historian Robert Kimball would say of it, quote, "It wasn't a musical work per se, and it wasn't a drama per se. It elicited response from both music and drama critics. But the work has sort of always been outside category." Alright, let's talk about race. The Gershwin brothers demanded that only black players be allowed to play the lead roles while performing the opera in the US, which helped launch the careers of several black opera singers. On one hand, there were some black singers who loved the opera, with one cast member calling Gershwin the, quote, "Abraham Lincoln of Negro music." On the other hand, there were some black artists, actually a lot of them, who didn't like it, which only grew stronger during the Civil Rights Movement. Actor and civil rights activist Harry Belafonte refused to play Porgy in the 1959 film adaptation of the opera. The actor who did play Porgy, Sidney Poitier, only did so after being pressured by the film's producer Samuel Goldwyn. Additionally, composer Virgil Thompson, who was white, said of the opera, quote, "Folklore subjects recounted by an outsider are only valid as long as the folk in question is unable to speak for itself," which is certainly not true of the American Negro in 1935. There's even an alleged quote from jazz composer Duke Ellington where he says, quote, "The Times are here to debunk Gershwin's lamp-like Negroisms." However, this quote was likely made up by a journalist after an interview with Ellington, who would disassociate from the article that the quote was presented in. As a matter of fact, in a telegram to the producer of the 1952 revival of the opera, Ellington said, quote, "You're Porgy and Bess, the super best, singing the gonest, acting the craziest, Gershwin the greatest."
Lakers in 5.
Okay, enough about race. Everyone behave yourselves in the comments. Gershwin moved to Los Angeles, California in 1936, becoming friends and tennis partners with Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg. Gershwin also asked Schoenberg for lessons, but just like Boulanger and Ravel, Schoenberg turned him down, saying, quote, "I would only make you a bad Schoenberg, and you're such a good Gershwin already." Gershwin was then commissioned by RKO Pictures to write the score for the film Shall We Dance, which took him several months to compose and orchestrate. He would also write the scores for A Damsel in Distress and The Goldwyn Follies. Multiple songs from these films became popular hits in jazz standards. Starting in 1937, Gershwin began complaining about headaches and smelling burning rubber, which no one else around him could smell. In a performance of his Concerto in F with the San Francisco Symphony, Gershwin, who was normally excellent at performing his own works, had coordination problems and even blacked out during the performance. At the time, Gershwin was working on Hollywood film scores while living with Ira and his wife Lenore in Beverly Hills. Lenore was disturbed by Gershwin's mood swings and suspected he was mentally ill. She suggested that her brother-in-law move in with lyricist Yip Harburg, who lived nearby. Not too long after, Gershwin collapsed in Harburg's house while working on the score of The Goldwyn Follies. He was rushed to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital and fell into a coma. Doctors believed Gershwin had a brain tumor, which led to neurosurgeon Walter Dandy flying out to LA for surgery. Once Dandy arrived, doctors had already removed a large brain tumor believed to have been a form of cancer. On July 11, 1937, George Gershwin died in the hospital at just 38 years old. Writer John O'Hara would say of his death, quote, "I don't have to believe it if I don't want to." Gershwin was buried at Westchester Hills Cemetery in New York. A memorial concert was given at the Hollywood Bowl 2 months later, with German conductor Otto Klemperer conducting one of his works. According to longtime BBC director and producer Rodney Greenberg, Gershwin fused many popular elements of American music, including blues and ragtime, as well as Hispanic rhythms, Hebrew chant, and various classical composers. He was influenced in particular by early 20th century French composers, with symphonic works resembling that of Ravel. Conversely, Ravel's piano concerto resembled that of Gershwin. Ravel would say of this, quote, "Personally, I find jazz most interesting. The rhythms, the way the melodies are handled, the melodies themselves. I've heard of George Gershwin's works, and I find them intriguing." Gershwin himself would say of his own style, quote, "True music must reflect the thought and aspirations of the people in time. My people are Americans. My time is today." Some other composers that have influenced Gershwin include the aforementioned Schoenberg, as well as Igor Stravinsky, Dmitri Shostakovich, Darius Milhaud, and Alban Berg. Although many composers have turned down teaching Gershwin, one person who did teach him was Joseph Schillinger, who was substantial in providing him a method of composition, although there is some disagreement on how much Schillinger influenced Gershwin. After the posthumous success of Porgy and Bess, Schillinger claimed that he had a large and direct influence over the direction of the opera. Ira, however, declines that his brother had any assistance in writing the opera. In any case, Gershwin recorded many of his works during his life, including Rhapsody in Blue, Swanee, and he played the celeste part in a 1929 recording of An American in Paris. In 1983, The Uris Theater on Broadway was renamed to the Gershwin Theater, and the Gershwin Prize for Popular Song was created by the Library of Congress in 2007. There also have been a number of works that use Gershwin's music. Georgian American ballet choreographer George Balanchine choreographed 16 of Gershwin's songs in his ballet Who Cares? In addition, a 1945 biography of Gershwin used parts of his music, and the music to the 1979 film Manhattan consists entirely of Gershwin's works. After Gershwin's death, his estate was passed to his mother Rose, which continues to collect royalties of the composer's works in the U.S. The estate also supported the 1998 Copyright Term Extension Act, which extended the estate's hold on Gershwin's works from 75 years to 95 years. Make of that what you will. Lastly, in 2013, both the George and Irish estates partnered with the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, giving the university access to Gershwin's entire musical archive. Other interesting facts about Gershwin include him allowing his Strike Up the Band to be used as a fight song for the UCLA Bruins football team, and in 2005, The Guardian took estimates of Gershwin's earnings and determined that he was the wealthiest composer of all time.